Marcus had protected celebrities, politicians, and billionaires for 15 years. He had faced down armed threats, stalkers, and assassination attempts without breaking a sweat. But on that rainy Tuesday morning in October, something happened that made this battle-hardened security expert pack his bags and disappear within 2 hours. No notice, no explanation to his employer, just gone. For 3 years, Marcus kept his silence about why he abandoned the most lucrative job of his career, protecting tech mogul Jonathan Blackwood and his family. The non-disclosure agreement he signed was worth millions, and breaking it could destroy him financially and legally. But when Blackwood's empire started crumbling in the headlines, Marcus realized that some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. What he witnessed behind the closed doors of the Blackwood mansion wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. And the deeper he got into protecting this family, the more he realized he wasn't just guarding their lives, he was guarding their darkest secrets. Secrets that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. This is the story Marcus finally decided to tell, knowing it might be the last story he ever gets to share. Because some truths are worth the risk, even when that risk includes everything you've worked for, everyone you love, and possibly your life itself. The question isn't why Marcus left so suddenly. The question is why he waited so long to speak up, and whether his silence made him complicit in something far worse than he ever imagined. Marcus Rivera stood outside the towering glass building that housed Blackwood Industries, adjusting his earpiece for the third time in 5 minutes. 15 years in personal security had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him this job was different from the others. The pay was too good. The background check had been too thorough, and Jonathan Blackwood himself had insisted on conducting the final interview personally, something billionaires rarely bothered with. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor gave Marcus time to review what he knew about his potential employer. Jonathan Blackwood, 43 years old, had built his fortune in artificial intelligence and data mining. His company processed information for governments, corporations, and private clients across the globe. On paper, it looked like a standard tech success story. But Marcus had learned long ago that the most dangerous clients were often the ones with the cleanest public images. Blackwood's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hoffman, led Marcus through a maze of minimalist offices toward the corner suite. The entire floor buzzed with activity. But Marcus noticed something odd about the employees. They all seemed to avoid eye contact with outsiders, hunching over their computers with an intensity that suggested fear rather than dedication. When Patricia knocked on Blackwood's office door, Marcus could hear multiple voices inside suddenly go, "Quiet." The man who opened the door didn't look like the polished executive from the company photos. Jonathan Blackwood appeared tired, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him fidget constantly. His handshake was firm but damp with perspiration, and when he smiled, it never reached his eyes. Marcus had protected enough guilty people to recognize the signs immediately. Blackwood's office was a study in contradictions. Expensive art hung on the walls, next to multiple security monitors showing feeds from around the building. His desk held family photos of a beautiful wife and 2 young children, but also a secure phone that looked military-grade, and a locked briefcase that never left his side. Most telling of all were the windows, bulletproof glass that had been tinted so dark that the room felt like a bunker, despite being 52 floors above the city. During their conversation, Blackwood explained that he needed personal protection for himself and his family due to business competitors who had made vague threats. The story sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced it in front of a mirror. Marcus probed gently, asking about specific threats and security incidents, but Blackwood deflected every question with corporate doublespeak about market pressures and industry dynamics. What really caught Marcus's attention wasn't what Blackwood said, but what happened while he was saying it. Twice during their meeting, Blackwood's secure phone buzzed with messages that made the man's face go pale. Each time he excused himself to read the message, and each time he returned looking more agitated than before. The third time the phone buzzed, Blackwood simply shut it off and shoved it into his briefcase. The job offer was generous to the point of being suspicious. $200,000 annually, plus housing on the family estate, plus a signing bonus of $50,000 cash. In return, Marcus would provide 24/7 protection for Blackwood, his wife Elena, and their children, 8-year-old Sophia, and 6-year-old David. The contract included a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive that it covered everything from the family's daily routine to their medical information to any business activities Marcus might observe. Marcus had signed plenty of NDAs in his career, but this one was different. Most confidentiality agreements focused on protecting privacy and preventing embarrassing revelations. This contract read like it was designed to prevent criminal testimony. Clauses about privileged communications and protected observations suggested that Blackwood expected his security team to witness things that might normally require reporting to authorities. Despite his reservations, Marcus found himself intrigued by the challenge. He had spent the last 5 years protecting an aging oil executive whose biggest security risk was his habit of picking up prostitutes in dangerous neighborhoods. Before that, he had guarded a pharmaceutical heiress whose main threat came from animal rights activists throwing paint at her car. The work had become routine, almost boring. Blackwood clearly had real enemies, which meant real danger, which meant Marcus would finally get to use all of his training again. The Blackwood estate sat on 47 acres in the hills outside the city, surrounded by 12-foot walls topped with razor wire. The main house was a modernist fortress of steel and glass that managed to look both beautiful and intimidating. Security cameras covered every inch of the property, and Marcus counted at least 6 guards patrolling the grounds in rotating shifts. For a man worried about business competitors, Blackwood had assembled the kind of security apparatus usually reserved for heads of state. Marcus's first meeting with Elena Blackwood only deepened his concerns about the assignment. The woman who greeted him at the front door bore little resemblance to the happy wife in her husband's office photos. Elena looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, with hollow cheeks and nervous gestures that suggested chronic anxiety. When she shook Marcus's hand, he noticed fading bruises on her wrists that she had tried to cover with makeup and long sleeves. The children seemed surprisingly well adjusted considering their parents' obvious stress. Sophia, the 8-year-old, was precocious and talkative, eager to show Marcus her art projects and explain the daily routine. David, the 6-year-old, was quieter but friendly, spending most of his time building elaborate structures with blocks and Legos. Both children seemed genuinely happy to have a new adult around, which made Marcus wonder how isolated they had become on the heavily secured estate. Elena's behavior around her husband told Marcus everything he needed to know about the family dynamics. Whenever Blackwood entered a room, Elena's posture would shift subtly, her shoulders tensing and her voice becoming more formal. She deferred to him on every decision, even minor ones about meals or schedules, and Marcus noticed that she never contradicted anything her husband said, even when she clearly disagreed. The first night on the job, Marcus was assigned to a guest suite in the main house that had been converted into a security station. Multiple monitors showed feeds from cameras throughout the property, and a sophisticated communication system kept him in contact with the other guards. But what struck Marcus most was how quiet the house became after 10 o'clock. No television sounds, no conversation, no normal family noise, just an oppressive silence that suggested everyone was walking on eggshells. Around midnight, Marcus heard raised voices coming from the master bedroom on the floor above. The argument was too muffled to make out specific words, but the tone was clear enough. Blackwood was angry about something, and Elena was trying to calm him down. The conversation went on for nearly an hour before ending abruptly with the sound of a door slamming. Marcus made a note in his security log about domestic disturbance, but wondered if he should have done more. The next morning, Elena appeared at breakfast with fresh bruises on her neck that she had hastily covered with concealer and a high-necked sweater. When Sophia asked her mother why she was wearing such warm clothes on a hot day, Elena's response was so obviously rehearsed that even the 8-year-old looked skeptical. Blackwood seemed oblivious to the awkwardness, focusing entirely on his phone and briefcase while his family ate in uncomfortable silence. Marcus's instincts were screaming that this job was going to be more complicated than simple executive protection. The family dynamics were clearly dysfunctional, possibly abusive. The security measures seemed excessive for normal business threats, and Blackwood himself displayed all the signs of a man living in constant fear of exposure. But the money was good. And Marcus told himself that family dysfunction wasn't his problem as long as everyone stayed safe from outside threats. The first week passed quietly enough to lull Marcus into thinking he might have been overreacting. He established security routines coordinated with the other guards and began to understand the family's daily patterns. Blackwood left for the office every morning at 7:30 and returned home around 8 in the evening. Elena rarely left the estate except for supervised trips to the grocery store or the children's school. The kids seemed happy and healthy, attending a private school that specialized in children from high-security families. But on Friday of that first week, Marcus got his first real glimpse of what he had signed up for. Blackwood received a phone call during dinner that sent him into a rage unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed from a client. The man screamed obscenities at whoever was on the other end of the line, threatening legal action and worse. When he finally hung up, he swept everything off the dining room table, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor while his family cowered in their chairs. Elena immediately began cleaning up the mess while making soothing noises to calm her husband down. The children disappeared upstairs without being told, clearly following a routine they had practiced many times before. Blackwood stormed out of the house toward his private office building on the grounds, leaving Marcus alone with Elena and the destroyed dinner. That was the moment Marcus realized he wasn't just protecting this family from outside threats. He was also protecting their secrets from the outside world. And judging by Blackwood's reaction to whatever news he had received, those secrets were big enough to destroy everything the man had built. Marcus just didn't know yet how big they really were or how dangerous they would become. The second week at the Blackwood estate brought Marcus deeper into the family's twisted reality. What he had initially dismissed as typical wealthy family dysfunction began to reveal itself as something far more sinister. The incident that opened his eyes happened on a Tuesday morning when Blackwood's business partner, Dr. Sarah Chen, arrived for an unscheduled meeting. Marcus was reviewing security footage from the previous night when he noticed Chen's arrival through the monitor system. The woman looked terrified as she approached the front door, constantly glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped her briefcase twice while walking up the driveway. When Elena answered the door, Marcus could see through the security cameras that Chen was crying. From his position in the security room, Marcus could hear voices but couldn't make out words. However, the tone of the conversation was unmistakable. Chen was pleading about something and Elena was trying to calm her down while quickly ushering her toward Blackwood's private office. Marcus made a note to review the audio recordings later, though he suspected those particular conversations would mysteriously be unavailable. 20 minutes later, Blackwood emerged from his office and headed straight for the security room where Marcus was stationed. The man's demeanor had changed completely from his usual nervous energy. Now he seemed focused and dangerous, with a cold calculation in his eyes that Marcus had seen before in military commanders about to order something terrible. Blackwood instructed Marcus to escort Dr. Chen off the property and ensure she understood that her visit had never happened. The specific words Blackwood used were chilling in their implications. Marcus was to make it crystal clear that Chen's safety depended on her discretion, and that any attempt to involve outside parties would be considered a hostile act against the family's security. Marcus had delivered plenty of veiled threats in his career, but this felt different. This felt like a prelude to violence. Dr. Chen looked like a broken woman when Marcus walked her to her car. Her earlier tears had dried, but her face held the hollow expression of someone who had just realized they were trapped in something much bigger than they could handle. As Marcus opened her car door, she grabbed his arm and whispered desperately that she never meant for things to go this far. Before Marcus could respond, she was in her car and driving away with the reckless speed of someone fleeing for their life. That evening, Marcus decided to review the security footage more carefully. What he discovered made him question everything about his new employer. The cameras had recorded Blackwood's meeting with Chen, but the audio had indeed been mysteriously corrupted for that specific time period. However, Marcus had experience with surveillance systems, and he knew how to recover data that wasn't completely erased. The conversation he reconstructed from partial audio files painted a disturbing picture. Chen was apparently a researcher who had discovered something about Blackwood's business operations that she wanted to expose. Her pleading had centered around her concern for the subjects and her belief that what they were doing was beyond illegal. Blackwood's responses were mostly inaudible, but Marcus caught enough fragments to understand that the man was threatening both Chen's career and her safety if she didn't stay silent. The most chilling moment came near the end of their conversation, when Blackwood's voice came through clearly enough to be understood. He told Chen that she had signed the same type of non-disclosure agreement that all of his associates signed, and that violation of that agreement had permanent consequences. The way he emphasized the word permanent left no doubt about what he meant. Marcus spent the next several days observing the family more closely, looking for clues about what Blackwood was really involved in. The man's daily routine included several activities that seemed unusual for a legitimate tech executive. Every morning, he spent 2 hours in a soundproofed room in the basement that was off-limits to all staff, including Marcus. The official explanation was that Blackwood needed absolute privacy for sensitive business calls, but Marcus noticed that no phone lines or internet cables ran to that room. Elena's behavior also became more explicable once Marcus started looking at it through the lens of fear rather than dysfunction. The woman wasn't just nervous around her husband. She was terrified of him. Every interaction between them followed the pattern of an abuse victim trying to avoid triggering her abuser. Elena anticipated Blackwood's moods, deflected his anger towards safe targets, and constantly monitored his emotional state to prevent explosions. The children had clearly been trained to recognize and respond to their father's dangerous moods as well. Whenever Blackwood's voice became sharp or his movements became agitated, Sophia and David would immediately become quiet and well-behaved, following predetermined routines designed to minimize their visibility. Marcus realized that the kids' apparent adjustment to their restricted lifestyle wasn't healthy adaptation. It was learned survival behavior. Marcus's growing concerns about the family situation were overshadowed by increasingly obvious signs that Blackwood's business operations involved more than data processing. The man received visitors at strange hours who didn't look like typical tech industry professionals. These guests arrived in unmarked vehicles with government license plates, stayed for brief meetings in the soundproof basement room, and left carrying briefcases they hadn't brought with them. One of these late-night visitors was a man Marcus recognized from his military days. Colonel James Morrison, who had been involved in classified psychological warfare programs before retiring from active duty. Morrison's presence at the Blackwood estate raised serious red flags. The colonel wasn't the type of person who visited civilian tech companies for legitimate business purposes. His specialty was human experimentation disguised as research. Marcus decided to test the limits of his access to the property by attempting to approach the basement room while Blackwood was away. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about his employer. The room wasn't just soundproofed, it was equipped with medical monitoring equipment, recording devices, and what appeared to be sensory deprivation apparatus. Documents left on a desk referenced subjects, behavioral modification, and neural pathway manipulation. Before Marcus could examine the documents more closely, he heard footsteps approaching. He barely had time to exit the room and pretend to be conducting a routine security sweep before Elena appeared in the hallway. Her reaction to finding him near the basement room was immediate and panicked. She begged him not to tell Blackwood that he had been in that area, explaining that her husband became very upset when anyone approached his private workspace. Elena's fear gave Marcus the opening he needed to start learning more about what was really happening at the estate. Over the next few days, he carefully built rapport with the woman, positioning himself as someone she could trust. Elena was desperate for an ally, and Marcus's protective presence made her feel safer than she had in months. Gradually, she began to hint at the truth behind her husband's business. The picture that emerged from Elena's carefully guarded revelations was horrifying. Blackwood's company wasn't just processing data, it was conducting illegal human experiments using subjects who had been told they were participating in legitimate research studies. The artificial intelligence technology was being used to map human neural responses to various forms of psychological manipulation, creating detailed profiles that could be used to control behavior and decision-making. Elena had discovered the truth about her husband's work by accident, finding files on his computer that described experiments conducted on homeless people, psychiatric patients, and refugees who had been promised money and medical care in exchange for their participation. The subjects were being subjected to various forms of psychological torture designed to break down their resistance and make them susceptible to behavioral programming. What made the situation even worse was Elena's growing suspicion that Blackwood was preparing to expand his experiments to include their own children. She had found educational materials in his office about child psychology and neural development, along with notes about optimal age ranges for behavioral modification. The basement room had been equipped with child-sized restraints and monitoring equipment that suggested Blackwood was planning to use Sophia and David as test subjects. Elena's attempts to confront her husband about the experiments had resulted in increasingly severe physical abuse. Blackwood had made it clear that she knew too much to ever leave him, and that any attempt to expose his work would result in the disappearance of both her and the children. Elena was trapped between her need to protect her children and her terror of what her husband might do if she tried to escape. Marcus realized that he was now in possession of information that went far beyond normal family dysfunction or even typical white-collar crime. Blackwood was conducting illegal human experiments that amounted to torture, and he was planning to expand those experiments to include his own children. The non-disclosure agreement Marcus had signed wasn't designed to protect business secrets. It was designed to ensure the silence of witnesses to crimes against humanity. The weight of this knowledge put Marcus in an impossible position. His professional obligation was to protect the family and maintain confidentiality about their private affairs. But his moral obligation as a human being was to stop the abuse of innocent victims and protect the children from their father's plans. The NDA he had signed made it clear that any violation would result in both criminal prosecution and civil liability that could destroy him financially. Marcus spent sleepless nights weighing his options while continuing to perform his security duties. He could try to gather enough evidence to take to law enforcement, but Blackwood's connections to government officials made it likely that any investigation would be buried or compromised. He could try to help Elena and the children escape, but Blackwood's resources and security apparatus made it almost impossible for them to disappear successfully. The decision was taken out of Marcus's hands when he discovered that Blackwood had been monitoring his activities more closely than he realized. Hidden cameras in the security room had recorded his attempts to access restricted areas of the house, and audio surveillance had captured his conversations with Elena. Marcus realized that he was no longer just a witness to Blackwood's crimes. He had become a potential threat that needed to be eliminated. The morning that would change everything started like any other day at the Blackwood estate. But by evening, Marcus would be forced to make a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of everyone trapped in Jonathan Blackwood's web of lies, manipulation, and unthinkable cruelty. Marcus woke up that Tuesday morning with the uneasy feeling that something was about to change. After 3 weeks at the Blackwood estate, he had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded the family's worst days. Elena had been unusually quiet during breakfast, speaking only when directly addressed and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The children seemed to sense their mother's tension, eating their cereal in unusual silence. But it was Blackwood himself who provided the clearest warning sign. He was almost cheerful, humming softly while reading his messages, and occasionally smiling at something on his phone. Marcus had worked with enough dangerous people to know that sudden good moods often preceded terrible actions. Blackwood's cheerfulness felt forced and manic, like a man who had finally decided to stop wrestling with his conscience and embrace something he knew was wrong. When Blackwood announced over breakfast that he would be working from home all day and wanted no interruptions, Marcus knew that whatever was coming would happen soon. The first indication of serious trouble came at 10:30 in the morning, when 2 unmarked vans arrived at the estate's main gate. Marcus recognized the vehicles from previous late-night visits, but this was the first time they had come during daylight hours. The drivers showed identification to the gate guards, but Marcus noticed they made no attempt to announce their arrival to the main house through normal channels. From the security monitors, Marcus watched as 8 men in plain clothes unloaded equipment from the vans and headed toward the basement entrance of the main house. The equipment looked medical in nature: portable monitoring devices, IV stands, and what appeared to be restraint systems. Marcus's blood ran cold as he realized that Blackwood was preparing to conduct one of his experiments on the estate itself, rather than at his off-site facilities. Marcus immediately tried to locate Elena and the children, but they were nowhere to be found in the main house. Their bedrooms were empty, and Elena's car was still in the garage, which meant they hadn't left the property. A systematic search of the estate revealed that all 3 family members were in the basement level, in a section that Marcus had never been allowed to access. Security cameras showed Elena sitting in what looked like a waiting room, holding both children close to her while trying to appear calm. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't planning to experiment on strangers today. He was planning to use his own children as test subjects. The medical equipment, the restraints, the mood monitoring devices were all being prepared for Sophia and David. Elena knew what was coming, which explained her behavior at breakfast and her current attempt to comfort the children before whatever horror Blackwood had planned. Marcus tried to access the basement area through his security credentials, but found that his clearance had been revoked for those specific rooms. When he attempted to override the electronic locks using techniques from his military training, he discovered that the systems had been upgraded with additional security measures that would take hours to bypass. Blackwood had clearly planned this operation carefully, ensuring that Marcus would be unable to interfere until it was too late to stop. The sound of children crying echoed through the ventilation system around noon, confirming Marcus's worst fears about what was happening in the basement. The cries weren't the normal sounds of upset children. They carried the desperate quality of genuine terror and pain. Marcus had heard similar sounds in war zones, from prisoners who were being tortured for information. The fact that these sounds were coming from 6- and 8-year-old children made his stomach turn with rage and revulsion. Marcus knew he was facing the moment that would define the rest of his life. He could follow his contract and his NDA, maintaining professional distance while children were tortured in the basement below him. He could tell himself that interfering would be illegal, that he had no authority to stop lawful activities on private property, that his primary obligation was to his employer rather than to abstract moral principles. But deep down, Marcus knew that some lines could never be uncrossed, and that failing to act now would haunt him forever. His military training had taught him that successful operations required careful planning and precise execution, but this situation demanded immediate action regardless of the risks. Marcus began methodically preparing to breach the basement security, knowing that once he started down this path, there would be no turning back. His contract with Black would be terminated, his non-disclosure agreement would be violated, and his career in personal security would likely be over. But the alternative was standing by while children were tortured by their own father. The breakthrough came when Marcus remembered that the estate's ventilation system connected all levels of the main house, including the restricted basement areas. The ducts were large enough to accommodate a person, and Marcus's military experience included training in confined space infiltration. It would be dangerous and uncomfortable, but it offered a way to reach Elena and the children without triggering the electronic security systems. Marcus spent 20 minutes working his way through the ventilation shafts, following the sound of voices toward the basement laboratory. What he saw when he reached an air vent overlooking the main experimental room was worse than anything he had imagined during his military service. Sophia and David were strapped to medical tables, while technicians attached electrodes to their heads and arms. Both children were crying and calling for their mother, who was being held in a separate room where she could see everything but couldn't intervene. Blackwood stood in the center of the laboratory, wearing a white coat and surgical gloves, directing the technicians with the casual efficiency of someone conducting routine business. He showed no sign of emotional distress at his children's terror, treating their cries as simply another data point to be recorded and analyzed. Marcus realized that whatever humanity Blackwood might once have possessed had been completely consumed by his obsession with his research. The experimental setup was designed to measure the children's neurological responses to various forms of psychological stress. Marcus could see monitors displaying brain activity, heart rate, and other physiological data, while the technicians subjected Sophia and David to controlled doses of fear, pain, and confusion. The goal appeared to be mapping exactly how their young brains responded to trauma, presumably to develop more effective methods of behavioral control. Marcus had seen enough battlefield horrors to steel himself against most forms of human cruelty, but watching two innocent children being tortured by their father in the name of science pushed him beyond his breaking point. The careful professionalism that had defined his career evaporated, replaced by pure rage and a determination to stop the horror below regardless of the consequences. Getting into the laboratory required Marcus to drop from the ventilation shaft into a storage room filled with medical supplies and recording equipment. The noise of his entry alerted one of the technicians, but Marcus was on the man before he could raise an alarm. 15 years of combat training made the physical confrontation brief and decisive, though Marcus was careful to avoid lethal force despite his fury. The laboratory erupted into chaos when Marcus burst through the main door. Blackwood shouted orders to his technicians while frantically trying to secure his research data, but most of his staff were focused on getting out of the way of an obviously dangerous man. Marcus's priority was getting the children free from their restraints and stopping the immediate torture, but he also wanted to preserve evidence of what Blackwood had been doing. Sophia and David were traumatized but physically unharmed when Marcus freed them from the medical tables. Both children clung to him desperately, begging him not to let the doctors hurt them anymore. The electrodes attached to their heads had left red marks on their skin, and both were shaking uncontrollably from the stress of what they had endured. Marcus carried them both toward the door, determined to get them away from the laboratory before Blackwood could stop him. Elena met them in the hallway, having been released from her holding room when the technicians abandoned their positions. The woman was sobbing with relief and rage, alternating between comforting her children and expressing her gratitude to Marcus for stopping the experiment. She confirmed that Blackwood had been planning to conduct increasingly severe tests on Sophia and David, using them to develop techniques that would later be applied to other victims. Blackwood's reaction to the interruption revealed the depth of his sociopathy. Rather than showing concern for his traumatized children, he berated Marcus for destroying months of careful preparation and ruining what he called a groundbreaking research opportunity. The man seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would object to using children as laboratory subjects, treating Marcus's intervention as an act of professional sabotage rather than moral necessity. The confrontation between Marcus and Blackwood quickly escalated beyond words. When Blackwood threatened to have Marcus arrested for assault and trespassing, Marcus made it clear that any attempt to involve law enforcement would result in full disclosure of the illegal experiments. Blackwood's response was to threaten Elena and the children with violence if Marcus didn't agree to keep silent about what he had witnessed. The standoff revealed that both men understood they were now engaged in a conflict that would determine the fate of everyone involved. Marcus realized that simply stopping the immediate experiment wasn't enough to protect Elena and the children from future harm. Blackwood's obsession with his research had clearly progressed beyond any reasonable boundaries, and his willingness to use his own family as test subjects indicated that no one in his orbit was safe. The man had the resources and connections to continue his illegal activities indefinitely unless he was permanently stopped. The solution came to Marcus in a moment of clarity that cut through his anger and confusion. He couldn't just rescue Elena and the children from this particular situation. He had to destroy Blackwood's entire operation in a way that would prevent it from ever resuming. That meant gathering evidence, exposing the illegal experiments, and ensuring that all victims received justice. But it also meant accepting that his own life would never be the same again. The decision to become a whistleblower, rather than simply a rescuer, changed everything about Marcus's approach to the crisis. Instead of focusing solely on getting the family to safety, he began systematically documenting Blackwood's crimes and preparing to expose them to the world. The basement laboratory contained years' worth of research data, video recordings of experiments, and financial records that would prove the scope of Blackwood's illegal activities. As Marcus worked to secure evidence and plan the family's escape, he could hear Blackwood on the phone with various associates, trying to minimize the damage and plan his own response to the security breach. The man's conversations revealed the true extent of his operation, including connections to government officials who had been protecting his research and corporate partners who had been funding his experiments. Marcus realized that exposing Blackwood would also expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond one man's obsession with behavioral control. The final confrontation came when Blackwood returned to the laboratory with additional security personnel, intending to regain control of the situation through force. But Marcus was no longer just a bodyguard following orders. He was a man who had seen too much to ever go back to normal life. The battle for control of the Blackwood estate would determine whether justice would be served or whether the truth would be buried along with everyone who knew it. The confrontation in the basement laboratory had torn away any pretense of normalcy between Marcus and Blackwood. As sirens wailed in the distance, both men understood that the authorities were already en route, though neither knew who had called them or what story they would be told. Marcus had Elena and the children huddled behind an overturned medical table, while Blackwood positioned himself near the laboratory's main computer system, clearly preparing to destroy evidence if necessary. The sound of approaching vehicles prompted Blackwood to reveal just how deep his connections ran within law enforcement and government circles. He calmly informed Marcus that the responding officers were friends who would help resolve this domestic security situation in a way that protected everyone's interests. The implication was clear. Marcus would be arrested as an unstable employee who had suffered a breakdown and attacked his employer, while any evidence of illegal experimentation would conveniently disappear. Marcus's military experience had taught him to always have multiple exit strategies, but the Blackwood estate security measures were designed to keep people in as much as keep threats out. The 12-foot walls, razor wire, and electronic surveillance created a prison as much as a fortress. However, Marcus had spent 3 weeks studying every inch of the property, and he knew about vulnerabilities that Blackwood's security team had overlooked. Elena's detailed knowledge of her husband's daily routines proved invaluable in planning their escape. She revealed that Blackwood maintained emergency protocols for destroying evidence and disappearing if his operations were ever compromised. These protocols included safe houses, untraceable vehicles, and financial resources that could support years of hiding. More importantly, Elena had secretly photographed many of these contingency plans during her desperate search for leverage against her husband. The arriving police officers confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the depth of Blackwood's corruption. Instead of conducting a normal investigation, they immediately began taking orders from Blackwood about how to handle the situation. Marcus watched through security monitors as officers secured the perimeter and prepared to storm the basement, clearly intending to use lethal force against anyone who resisted. Elena's children would likely be caught in the crossfire of a staged rescue operation. Marcus made the decision to split up their escape, knowing that a group with young children would move too slowly to avoid capture. He would create a diversion by attempting to fight his way out through the main entrance, drawing the corrupt officers away from Elena and the children. Meanwhile, Elena would use her knowledge of the estate's service tunnels to reach the north wall, where Marcus had identified a weakness in the security perimeter. The evidence Marcus had gathered from the laboratory needed to reach the outside world, regardless of what happened to any of them personally. He used Elena's phone to upload critical files to multiple cloud storage accounts and sent copies to journalists, human rights organizations, and federal agencies that might be beyond Blackwood's reach. Even if they were all killed or discredited, the truth about Blackwood's experiments would eventually surface. Elena's transformation from terrorized victim to determined mother was remarkable to witness. The woman who had spent months cowering from her husband's threats found strength she didn't know she possessed when her children's lives were at stake. She helped Marcus barricade the laboratory entrance while calmly explaining to Sophia and David that they were going to play a hiding game that would keep them safe from the bad men upstairs. The first assault on the laboratory came 20 minutes after the police arrived, but Marcus was ready for it. His military training in urban warfare gave him significant advantages over small-town officers who rarely faced serious resistance. The narrow hallways and multiple rooms of the basement level allowed Marcus to use guerrilla tactics that kept his opponents off balance while conserving his ammunition. Blackwood's growing desperation became evident as the standoff continued. He began threatening to kill Elena and the children himself, rather than allow them to be taken alive and potentially testify against him. The man's careful facade of civilized respectability had completely crumbled, revealing the sociopathic core that had enabled years of torture and human experimentation. Marcus realized that negotiation was impossible with someone who viewed other people as disposable research materials. Elena's knowledge of the estate's construction proved crucial when she revealed the location of a maintenance shaft that connected the basement to the estate's water treatment facility. The shaft was too narrow for most adults but could accommodate the children and a small person like Elena. Marcus could use the distraction of their escape to make his own break for freedom, though his chances of survival were considerably lower given the number of armed men now surrounding the building. The most difficult moment came when Marcus had to explain to 6-year-old David and 8-year-old Sophia that they might not see him again after today. Both children had bonded with Marcus during his weeks protecting them, and leaving them felt like abandoning his most important mission. But ensuring their escape was more important than his own survival, and Elena needed to focus entirely on getting them to safety without worrying about his welfare. Marcus's diversionary assault began with explosive charges he had fashioned from cleaning supplies and materials found in the laboratory. The detonations created enough confusion and apparent danger to draw most of the police officers toward the main basement entrance, giving Elena precious time to lead the children through the maintenance shaft toward the water treatment facility. Marcus could hear their progress through the building's communication system, tracking their movement toward relative safety. The running battle through the estate's basement level revealed just how extensively Blackwood's operation had been integrated into the property's design. Hidden rooms contained additional experimental equipment, holding cells that had obviously been used to confine unwilling subjects, and storage areas filled with medical supplies and restraint devices. Marcus began systematically destroying everything he could while fighting his way toward his planned escape route. Elena's voice crackled through Marcus's radio earpiece as she reported reaching the water treatment facility with both children. They had encountered no resistance, but the next phase of their escape would require crossing open ground to reach the weak point in the estate's north wall. Marcus needed to maintain his diversion for at least 10 more minutes to give them enough time to get clear of the property before anyone realized they were gone. Blackwood's final attempt to regain control came when he threatened to release toxic gas into the building's ventilation system, claiming that he would rather kill everyone than allow his research to be exposed. Marcus realized that the man was beyond rational thought, driven entirely by a narcissistic rage at having his power challenged. The threat might be a bluff, but Marcus couldn't risk the lives of Elena and the children on that assumption. The toxicity of Blackwood's true nature became fully apparent when Marcus discovered that the man had been recording his children's torture, not just for research purposes, but for his own psychological gratification. Video files on the laboratory computers showed that Blackwood had been conducting unauthorized experiments on Sophia and David for months, subjecting them to various forms of psychological abuse while documenting their responses. Elena had been unaware of the full extent of her husband's crimes against their children. Marcus's escape route took him through the estate's garage, where he discovered that Blackwood had been preparing for a much larger operation than anyone had suspected. Multiple vehicles were equipped with medical transport equipment, suggesting that Blackwood had been planning to expand his human experimentation to include mobile operations. Shipping documents indicated that similar facilities were being established in other locations, meaning that the estate laboratory was just one node in a much larger network of illegal research sites. The revelation that Blackwood's operation was international in scope added urgency to Marcus's mission. Destroying this single facility wouldn't be enough to stop the organization behind it. The evidence Marcus had uploaded to cloud storage needed to reach investigators who could coordinate international law enforcement efforts to shut down the entire network. Elena and the children were fleeing from something much larger and more dangerous than a single abusive husband and father. Marcus's final radio contact with Elena came as she reported successfully breaching the north wall and reaching a public road beyond the estate. A pre-arranged contact was waiting to transport them to a safe house, where they could hide while the evidence Marcus had gathered was analyzed and verified. Both children were physically unharmed but deeply traumatized by their experience, requiring psychological counseling to recover from their father's abuse. The escape from the estate required Marcus to abandon everything he had built over 15 years in personal security. His reputation, his professional contacts, and his financial security were all sacrificed to protect 3 people he had known for less than a month. But as Marcus fought his way through Blackwood's security forces and corrupt law enforcement allies, he understood that some things were more important than career success or personal safety. Blackwood's last act of desperation came when he realized that his operation had been completely compromised. Rather than face justice for his crimes, he chose to trigger the estate's destruction using explosive charges that had been installed as a final contingency plan. The man who had spent years torturing others for research purposes couldn't accept the prospect of being held accountable for his actions. The explosion that destroyed the Blackwood estate lit up the night sky like a small sun, taking with it years of evidence and eliminating any chance of recovering additional victims who might have been held at the facility. But the evidence Marcus had already extracted and transmitted was enough to begin unraveling the broader conspiracy that had enabled Blackwood's crimes. The destruction of the estate marked the end of one horror and the beginning of a much larger investigation. Marcus emerged from the ruins of his former life with nothing but the clothes on his back and the satisfaction of knowing that Elena, Sophia, and David were safe. The career he had worked so hard to build was over, replaced by a new mission to ensure that justice was served for all of Blackwood's victims. The man who had once protected the wealthy and powerful from their enemies had become the enemy of those who preyed on the innocent and vulnerable. The immediate danger was over, but Marcus knew that the real battle was just beginning. Blackwood's death had eliminated one monster, but the network that had supported and profited from his crimes was still intact. Marcus would spend the rest of his life fighting to expose and destroy that network, knowing that the children he had saved deserved a world where such horrors could never happen again. 3 years after the destruction of the Blackwood estate, Marcus Rivera sat in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, preparing to break his silence for the first time since that terrible October night. The intervening years had been a mixture of legal battles, personal rehabilitation, and careful investigation into the network that had enabled Jonathan Blackwood's crimes. Now, with new evidence emerging that threatened to bury the truth forever, Marcus knew he could no longer remain silent. The official story told by law enforcement painted Marcus as an unstable former military contractor who had suffered a psychological breakdown and attacked his employer's family. Blackwood was portrayed as a tragic victim who had died trying to protect his wife and children from a deranged employee. Elena and the children had supposedly perished in the explosion that destroyed the estate, though their bodies were never found due to the intensity of the fire. Marcus had spent the first year after the incident in hiding, using skills learned during his military service to avoid detection while the corrupt investigation ran its course. The evidence he had uploaded to cloud storage accounts had been systematically suppressed or discredited, with investigators claiming that the files had been fabricated by Marcus to justify his violent actions. Witnesses who might have contradicted the official story had either disappeared or recanted their testimony after receiving visits from federal agents. The breakthrough that changed everything came when Dr. Sarah Chen contacted Marcus through a secure communication channel established by investigative journalists. Chen had spent 3 years living in terror, convinced that speaking out about Blackwood's experiments would result in her death. But when she learned that Marcus was alive and fighting to expose the truth, she found the courage to come forward with evidence that corroborated everything Marcus had witnessed. Chen's testimony revealed the true scope of Blackwood's operation. The experiments conducted at the estate were part of a larger program funded by defense contractors and overseen by intelligence agencies seeking to develop advanced interrogation and behavioral control techniques. Homeless people, psychiatric patients, refugees, and political dissidents had been subjected to torture disguised as medical research, with the goal of creating more effective methods of breaking human resistance. The financial records Chen had preserved showed that Blackwood's operation had received millions of dollars in funding from sources within the government and private defense contractors. The money had been laundered through legitimate-seeming research grants and medical equipment purchases, but the ultimate goal was always the development of torture techniques that could be used against enemies of the state. Elena's children had been selected as test subjects because their psychological profiles matched target demographics for future applications. Marcus's decision to go public with his story was triggered by the discovery that similar operations were still active in other locations. Intelligence sources confirmed that Blackwood's network had simply restructured after his death, moving their operations to international sites beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement. Children were still being tortured in the name of research, and the techniques developed through years of illegal experimentation were being used against prisoners and political opponents around the world. Elena Blackwood emerged from 3 years of hiding to support Marcus's testimony, bringing with her detailed documentation of her husband's crimes that she had secretly gathered over months of living in terror. The woman who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper now commanded attention in congressional hearing rooms and television interviews, describing the horrors her children had endured with calm precision that made her testimony impossible to dismiss or discredit. Sophia and David, now 11 and 9 years old respectively, had undergone extensive psychological treatment to help them recover from their father's abuse. Their therapists confirmed that both children showed signs of complex trauma consistent with prolonged torture, but also demonstrated remarkable resilience in their recovery. Elena had worked tirelessly to help them rebuild their sense of safety and trust, creating a new life far from the shadows of their father's crimes. The investigation that followed Marcus's public testimony revealed connections between Blackwood's operation and similar programs dating back decades. Government documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that illegal human experimentation had been an ongoing government priority, with numerous facilities conducting research on mind control, behavioral modification, and enhanced interrogation techniques. Blackwood's estate had been just one node in a vast network of taxpayer-funded torture laboratories. Marcus's military background proved crucial in understanding the strategic implications of what he had uncovered. The techniques being developed through illegal human experimentation weren't just intended for use against foreign enemies. They were part of a broader program to develop domestic population control methods. The ability to break down individual psychological resistance and manipulate behavior on a mass scale represented a fundamental threat to democratic institutions and human rights. The legal battle to hold accountable those responsible for Blackwood's operation revealed the depth of corruption within law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Many of the officials who had helped cover up the crimes were themselves products of the programs they were protecting, having been selected and promoted based on their willingness to prioritize institutional loyalty over moral considerations. Breaking the cycle of corruption required external pressure from journalists, human rights organizations, and international observers. Elena's transformation from victim to advocate became a powerful symbol of resistance against institutional abuse of power. Her willingness to speak truth to power, despite the personal risks involved, inspired other victims to come forward with their own stories of abuse at the hands of government-funded research programs. The woman who had once lived in constant fear of her husband became a voice for all those who had suffered in silence. Marcus's testimony before congressional investigators provided crucial insight into the operational details of illegal research programs. His military training allowed him to explain how the techniques being developed could be scaled up for use against entire populations, turning individual torture methods into weapons of mass psychological warfare. The implications for democratic society were staggering, as governments gained the ability to manipulate public opinion and behavior with unprecedented precision. The international ramifications of the Blackwood revelations forced governments around the world to acknowledge their own participation in illegal human experimentation programs. Treaties were violated, diplomatic relationships were strained, and international courts began investigating crimes against humanity committed in the name of national security. Marcus's decision to speak out had triggered a global reckoning with the dark side of government research programs. The personal cost of Marcus's decision to become a whistleblower was severe but ultimately worthwhile. His career in personal security was permanently over. His financial resources were depleted by legal battles, and his personal relationships were strained by years of living under assumed identities. But the knowledge that Elena, Sophia, and David were safe and that other potential victims had been protected made every sacrifice meaningful. The ongoing investigation into Blackwood's network uncovered evidence of hundreds of victims who had been subjected to illegal experimentation over the course of several decades. Many had died from their injuries or had been killed to prevent them from revealing what they had experienced. Others had been so psychologically damaged that they were unable to provide coherent testimony about their abuse. The scope of the crimes was beyond anything Marcus had initially imagined. Elena's advocacy work expanded to include other families affected by government-sponsored abuse, creating a network of survivors who supported each other through the difficult process of seeking justice. Her organization provided legal assistance, psychological counseling, and financial support to victims, while also working to expose ongoing abuses and prevent future crimes. The woman who had once been powerless to protect her own children became a protector for countless other families. Marcus's final act of defiance against those who had tried to silence him was the establishment of a secure communication network that allowed victims and witnesses to safely report abuse without fear of retaliation. Using encryption techniques learned during his military service, Marcus created a system that enabled people to share information about illegal government activities while protecting their identities and locations. The network became a crucial tool for exposing corruption and holding officials accountable for their crimes. The truth about Jonathan Blackwood's operation ultimately proved too large and well-documented to be suppressed indefinitely. Congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and civil lawsuits forced government agencies to acknowledge their participation in illegal activities and implement reforms designed to prevent future abuses. While justice came slowly and incompletely, the victims had finally been heard and their suffering officially recognized. Marcus Rivera's decision to break his silence had consequences far beyond his own personal situation. By choosing moral courage over professional security, he had helped expose crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The children he had protected grew up in a world where such horrors were less likely to remain hidden, and future victims had a better chance of finding help and support when they needed it most. The legacy of Marcus's courage extended beyond the specific crimes he had exposed. His example inspired other insiders to speak out against institutional abuse, creating a culture where moral integrity was valued over blind loyalty to authority. The man who had once protected the powerful from accountability had become a champion for those who had been powerless to protect themselves. As Marcus finished preparing his final testimony for the International Tribunal investigating crimes against humanity, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years earlier, he had been a successful bodyguard protecting wealthy clients from imaginary threats. Now he was a witness to real horrors who had helped expose systematic torture disguised as legitimate research. The question that had haunted Marcus since that October morning, whether his silence made him complicit in unspeakable crimes, had finally been answered. By choosing to act when action was required, by protecting the innocent when protection was needed, and by speaking truth when truth was demanded, Marcus had redeemed himself and helped others find their own path to justice and healing.